It's time to shift our focus to CSS. In this video, I'm going to explain to you the basics of CSS, including its structure and syntax. CSS is often referred to as the language of style, whereas HTML is used to create the structure and author the basic content of web pages. CSS is for presentation. CSS is short for Cascading Style Sheets, and the current version of CSS is CSS 3. Like many technical languages, CSS continues to evolve and change. HTML describes the structure. I like to use this picture to describe the differences between HTML and CSS. You can think of HTML as the structural layer, whereas CSS is the presentation layer. On the left side, you have the basic structure of the Lego guy. But on the right side, you see how he's been completely styled out. So that is HTML versus CSS. In CSS, you use what are called style sheets to create style rules. These style rules that you create describe how to display a web page, how to style the HTML elements. So in HTML, you write the elements. In CSS, you write CSS rules that style the elements on the page. CSS is like the hair, makeup, and wardrobe to a famous Hollywood actress. If a famous Hollywood actress just walked out of her house, that would be HTML. But once she's out of hair and makeup, that's HTML and CSS. So you can think of CSS as this process, as going from regular and bummy to all glossed up. Web browsers apply CSS rules. We discussed in the past how the browser's job is to look at your HTML, parse the tags, and then present a web page. Well, it's also your browser's job to parse CSS rules that you write and then use those rules to present the web page in a different way. So on the right side of the screen, I have an example for you. In HTML, I've written a paragraph. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. This is considered to be an HTML element. And elements are put on the page using what are called tags. Now below you will see a CSS style rule. What this does is colors the text of any paragraph on the page red. So what you see there highlighted is what's called a CSS rule. So this is ultimately how CSS works. CSS rules are created by you, and then the browser interprets those rules to style the HTML elements. I've got a great video here for you. It's called CSS Basics. It does a great job of getting you started with what CSS is, the problem it was intended to solve, and as always, there's 3 guided questions. Make sure that you can answer these 3 guided questions before you move on. When you write CSS, you ultimately set what are called properties. This is how you declare style. So properties define how the HTML elements that you write are to look on the page. So the whole purpose of CSS is to set properties. There are properties that almost every HTML element shares, and then there's some properties that only apply to some elements. In this example, I show you 3 different elements: color, font family, and font size. Color affects the color of text. Font family is what typeface or font to use for text, and then font size says how big every character should be. So these are all examples of CSS properties, and the whole purpose of CSS is to set properties. How do we set properties? We set properties using what are called CSS declarations. We declare style. We basically say, I declare that these HTML elements should be displayed this way. Ultimately, a CSS declaration is a name-value pair, a CSS property with a value. The property and the value are separated by a colon, and then if you have more than one CSS declaration, you terminate each with a semicolon to separate them. So here's an example of a CSS declaration. On the left, you'll see the property, color, and on the right, you'll see the value, red. Notice how a colon separates the property from its value, and then at the end, I have put in a semicolon, and this signifies the end of my declaration. You take this whole thing together, the property, the colon, the value, and the semicolon, and you have what's called a CSS declaration. In this case, this declaration would color the text red. If you want to do more than one CSS declaration, then you would put them into a declaration block. So here you'll notice I have 3 CSS declarations, one for color, one for font family, and one for font size. I've grouped all these together using opening and closing curly braces. When you group CSS declarations together using this opening and closing curly brace syntax, you have what's called a CSS declaration block. This allows you to apply more than one CSS property to an element at a time. The last piece is what's called a CSS selector. You need to be able to target what elements on the page you want to style. So we need this ability to select the elements to style. We don't always want to style everything on the page the same way. We need to target specific elements or groups of elements for a particular set of styling. And what we use to do that is called CSS selectors. There's many different varieties of CSS selector, and you'll be learning about those in this course as well. Think of CSS selectors as the thing that picks what things on the page to style. So creating a CSS rule is one part declaring style and one part specifying what elements on the page should this style apply to. So a selector is like something that picks which elements on the page that the style should apply to. So the selector goes to the left in the very beginning of your CSS declaration block. So the declaration block is very much about how should I style this thing? And then the selector tells the browser what things to target. So you'll see right here I have what's called an element selector, a P. This particular CSS rule would style all paragraphs on the page to have red text, to use the Arial font family, and to have a font size of 16 pixels. So the CSS selector is placed before the declaration block. And when you take this selector plus the declaration block, you have what's called a CSS rule or rule set. Got a video here I want you to watch. It's called CSS Selectors. This will give you an introduction to the basic selectors that you'll be using in the class. As always, there are 3 guided questions. Make sure that you can answer these before you move on. Okay, so let's put it all together. When you take your CSS declaration block and you marry it with a selector or group of selectors, you have what's called a CSS rule or rule set. Ultimately, when you create CSS, this is what you're doing. You're creating one or more CSS rules. And normally, you place these CSS rules in what's called a style sheet. So the terms CSS rule and CSS rule set are often used interchangeably, but a CSS rule will look something like this. It will be a selector plus a declaration block. Once again, this is a CSS rule. In this particular case, we have a selector, which is P, and then we have a declaration block. And inside that declaration block are 3 different style declarations. We've got a property value, property value, property value. Property is separated by a colon, terminated by a semicolon. So when you put it all together, you have CSS rules. Just like there were countless HTML elements for you to learn and master, there are countless CSS properties. But I want you to start by going to the Mozilla Developer Network and reviewing their CSS syntax page. Pay close attention to the vocabulary they use and the examples. By doing this, you'll be in a great position to master CSS with some practice. We have our mini project that goes with this presentation / video. It's called Stop in the Name of CSS. In this one, you're going to use CSS rules to color a traffic light. So the traffic light will be blank and you'll have to learn how to write some CSS to color in the 3 lights. Before we move on, let me demonstrate a couple things in CSS for you. The first thing I want you to understand is that HTML and CSS is often separated. So inside Thimble, for example, there is an index.html. This is the file that contains normally just your HTML. And then you'll see that there is another file, style.css. The .html extension means that it's for HTML. In this case, the .css extension means it's for CSS. You will notice, if you're in Thimble, that there already are some style rules in here. This one styles the body, this one styles the H1. What I want to do is let's write a style rule together. The first thing you do is you start with the selector. The only thing I have on a page right now is this paragraph. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Let's see if we can write a CSS rule that targets this paragraph right here. So we're going to go to style.css. Style.css is what's called a style sheet. A style sheet consists of CSS rules. And a CSS rule is a selector with a CSS declaration block. So let's style this paragraph. The selector would be P. Then I have my opening and closing curly brace. And then whatever rules I want to apply, whatever style declarations I want to make, need to go in here. So let's say I wanted to make the text really big. I could do something like this. Font size would be my property. 40 pixels would be the value. I separate the two with a colon and terminate with a semicolon. If I wanted to, let's say, color the text to, let's say, green, I could use the color property. If I wanted to give it a background color, let's say, almost like a highlighter, then I could do this. So this really is what CSS is. You basically create CSS rules. You can place them in a style sheet like I've done here, and they will target and style the elements that you have written in HTML. In addition to the other work I'm going to assign in the class, I'm going to have you work through Codecademy CSS in Overview. So this is part of a course that's out there online. And by going through this course over a couple of days' time, you'll become acquainted with CSS so that the material that I present to you in the future will make more sense. Make sure that you sign up for Codecademy and that you log in and complete CSS in Overview.